Low sentiment and unemployment drive gold. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ainslie Insights, brought to you by Ainslie Bullion, Ainslie Crypto, and the Gold and Silver Standard as the Ainslie Group celebrates 50 years. Today, we welcome back Sam, who's been looking at some potentially good, bad news, good news. We don't know these days which way it goes. Sometimes bad news is good news, but the combinations anyway, they're looking good for the price of gold. How are you going today, Sam?
Good, Chris. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. It is quite confusing, and you point some of these things out in your article today, but gold is bouncing at the moment. What is causing it?
Well, one of the things that's causing it is potentially the weak employment data that's come out the past couple of weeks. So you had, payroll data, and then that's followed up by initial unemployment claims as well. And this data puts pressure on the Fed to actually cut sooner rather than later, despite what people like to think they can just cut whenever they want or they can fight inflation as long as they want. They don't really want to be seen as the ones causing a crisis. So this could tug them in the direction of cutting sooner, which the stock market responded to and gold responded to really strongly as well.
And that really is the essence of this bad news is good news narrative that's around at the moment. I mean, you highlight in the article that it's really the Fed being backed into a corner here, where
Mhm.
it sort of seems like there's not a lot they can do either way without upsetting someone. I know there were more Fed speakers on the weekend. What were the takeaways here? What are the key talking points that are highlighting how the Fed might be thinking about all of this?
Well, I think one interesting thing was the Fed speakers had to go up against the um, University of Michigan's sentiment survey. And in that, we saw the biggest drop since August 2021. So this a follow-up of some really, really bad news that they had to combat. And they did the usual talking points where they say, we're assessing the situation. We don't know what's going on. We're just watching the data. So essentially talking like they're retail traders rather than, the Federal Reserve. Well, one thing that did shine through from me, one thing I was able to kind of parse out of all of this was Fed Governor Michelle Bowman mentioned that they need to maintain credibility in their fight for inflation, which I thought was a really interesting way of putting it. We need to keep people believing we're fighting inflation pretty much, and that compounds with the Fed's previous statements earlier about them just coming out and saying we're not trying to crash the economy, which is a very weird thing for a central bank to come out and to have to say, to come out and say, guess what? We're not trying to crash the economy. And then she's talking about credibility in maintaining the fight against inflation. So the continuous bad data that comes out is putting a lot of pressure on them and a lot of pressure on their credibility. And we have the CPI coming out soon as well, which could be, look, it could help them depending on which way it goes, or it could scrap their plan and essentially force them to cut earlier.
And credibility is such a interesting word to be using here because we've been arguing for quite a while now in all of these discussions that the Fed has really lost a lot of credibility throughout this whole process. And part of that has been on the back of exactly what you just said before, this constant speaking to the market, more like traders than like, people who are in that position that really should be well above pushing the market to and fro. Is this where gold comes into the picture? Is gold sniffing out here potentially a lack of credibility from the Fed and the real risks that are under the surface that they can get this wrong?
Yeah, and I just read a huge report this morning by a couple of analysts. And they were talking about why gold is a bad investment, why nobody should buy gold, and just all these reasons to not buy gold and why you should buy, into the stock market. And that was pretty interesting to me because essentially what they were saying is that central banks don't know what they're doing because central banks are one of the biggest players, buying up all the gold. So they're essentially saying to the richest entities on the planet, they don't know what they're doing, which I found pretty interesting. And it just looks like the smaller players, under the central banks, institutions or retail traders are just following along what central banks are doing and buying gold as well.
And that makes sense because anyone like disregarding what those people that you read said, like it makes sense to follow the money. It's always made sense to follow the money. It's always made sense to not fight the Fed and central banks. And if that's what they're doing, it makes sense to follow along. I know you look very heavily at the technical setup, and
Hmm.
the charts specifically when you're talking about gold. Is that flowing through into the technical analysis side of it as well?
We're looking at gold AUD and gold USD on the daily chart. What you can see on gold is a really strong aggressive rise and then a slight pullback, which from a technical point of view can be expected. Things don't just go up forever.
Hmm.
But that pullback across the end of last week until now has changed into a V-shaped recovery. So you have different types of recoveries. You have where the price drops and then it kind of flat lines a bit and then comes up. That's a bit of a weak recovery. Or you have where it double bottoms, for example. It's not really sure if it wants to go up yet, or a sort of a U-shaped where it kind of curves like a half pipe and swings back up. But what we have now is a V-shaped recovery. So it's the strongest recovery in technical analysis, and it's just stopped dead and started coming back up. Now, some of this could just be traders going off technicals, but it obviously was compounded with that bad news, putting, forcing the Fed's hand
Hmm.
really to try to cut sooner.
And you mentioned before the CPI that we're expecting to see coming up. So, do you really think that that could be the turning point here, where we really get that follow through potentially if the CPI number, I'm assuming, is weaker than expected, but if you get a stronger one, then it potentially puts a top in for now. How do you view the technical? What's your expectations around the technicals on the back of that CPI print?
I think your condition on there for now
Yeah.
is what I would be looking at, because this data release has a long history of causing immediate and intense movements in one or two directions, maybe some whipsawing, and then after the market kind of digests it more properly, and things either continue on their way or turn around. But I think it might just be temporary, whatever the result is, because it's pretty obvious that with all this bad data coming out, they can't just hold off forever. Of course, analysts are always thinking, at least for the past months, that they're going to cut sooner expected, and they've been, holding off. But it looks like it's just a matter of time. So the CPI data, look, you could get if it shocks gold back down, could potentially be, a good buy
Buy the
opportunity
dips. Yep.
if
Yep.
if one thinks it's going to then continue upward. But I don't think there's too much room for huge surprises.
No, and that does make sense. And particularly, as you said, it's not the only point people should be looking at. Certainly not. There's a lot of other data that's telling a different story. So even if that does come in a bit hotter than expected, it makes sense what you just said. It could be a buy the dip opportunity effectively because they can't hold off forever. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Well, thank you for all that work today again, Sam. Really appreciate your dive into that. And I know lots of people really like your insight into what we expect from gold this week out of that. So thanks for your work on that.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks everyone for watching. We'll chat again soon.